Genevieve, thank you so much for joining us on this very sunny Friday afternoon in London. Really grateful for your time for joining the podcast today. And I think, a wonderful way just to kick off would be for you to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your past, what your sport was, what you do now, and then I'll take all of that and run with it to push us through the next 30 minutes of the podcast.
Can do, and yeah, it's a pleasure to join. So thank you for having me on, Mark. So it's a bit of a background about myself as well. So my name's Genevieve Horton. I was born and raised in Sydney down in Australia, and I used to be an elite rower. So I was on our national team for 10 years, competing at junior, intermediate, and then senior international level, getting to 2 Olympics as well, which I was really fortunate to be able to have that opportunity to compete at. And so I'm now based in London, and I'm working in the motorsport industry, namely at Extreme E. So we're an electric off-road racing series, and we're a built-for-purpose organisation, meaning that everything we do is driven around raising awareness and driving change in areas of sustainability, so climate change and equal opportunity as well. So I work across our marketing and sustainability teams, so really on the storytelling side and helping create that positive legacy wherever we race, not only kind of within our own ecosystems, but outside of that as well.
Super exciting, and I'm sure we'll tap into that a little bit later as we crack on. But yeah, just rewinding, I guess, back to the beginning of your days in rowing. You obviously won the Junior World Champs, so quite early you showed to be quite good at rowing. When did you discover your love for rowing? At what point did you decide this is a sport I'm really into? And then secondly, at what point did you decide not only am I really into it, but actually I believe I could be one of the best in the world?
That's a really good question in that second part, especially there, as I think it's not something I've actually really pinpointed that moment down. So it's nice to cast back and think about it. But I remember we falling in love in the sport when I got out in a double scull. I think I would have been about 16 years old, and I got taken around for a row in the bay down on Iron Cove, in the outskirts of Sydney, down there, and just being in an outdoor sport, out in nature as well. I loved it so much. But I actually was not very good when I started at all. I think I was ranked in one of kind of our lower teams as well. But I got that really positive feedback loop early on in terms of seeing how I could make improvements. And it was very obvious to yourself when you're learning how to be more technically proficient in the boat, when you are getting better, because you can see that boat going faster with the numbers going down, and it feels better as well. So it was a really appealing sport, whether you are kind of more of a data-focused person or someone that does rely on more kind of look and feel as well, because you're getting that instant feedback. So once I kind of had that pin in my mind of, okay, I wanted to get into the first 8, which was similar to a first 15 for rugby as well. And where I really wanted to make sure I could kind of get myself into that top boat. So that really, it was kind of from those early sessions that I was hooked as well. And I kind of just kept building more and more momentum from there. It's interesting on the side of when I decided to have a proper crack at being elite as well. I think it just kind of came from my love of the sport. So I did 3 seasons at school, that wrapped up, and then I'd started getting into the club scene before I had finished completely with school. I think I'd started getting glimpses, and I realized that you could race on there was a junior team, which I had no idea that opportunities like that existed. I thought you basically just went from going to a club to then suddenly being in the Olympics. I didn't realize there was this whole talent pathway. And so I saw peers that I'd raced against at school wearing the green and gold and with the Aussie coat of arms on their chest. And I thought, that just looks amazing. And I just thought, well, why can't that be me? So essentially, I do remember that moment thinking back about it now, where I realized that if they could do it, so could I. So I just really decided to kind of throw everything in and see where we wanted to go that first year out of school. So I took a gap year just to focus on rowing, and it all went from there.
Interesting. So I've not met many rowers who start rowing, when they're 10 or 11 or 12. Swimmers are in the pool at 6. So were you generally quite sporty when you were younger? So when it did come to that age where you were now rowing and then it got serious, prior to that, were you just a sporty kid, and it just so happened that all that sportiness kind of manifested itself and presented itself really successfully into rowing?
Yeah, and it's funny because I did was very sporty when I was younger. Everybody grows up playing netball in Australia. Well, a lot of young girls, it's one of our most popular sports as well. So I did that for a good 5 or 6 years, going through primary school, and then in high school we had a lot of opportunities. So got into hockey, Was doing a lot of aerobic-based sports already, so cross-country, swimming, kind of running as well. I even was trying rhythmic gymnastics for a bit, but I was never making that top-tier team. I was always just missing out, so getting into the seconds or the thirds, and I really had that drive where I just wanted to be the best at something, because I was at a school where sporting excellence was emphasized, and so if you were in those top teams, you were kind of like glorified at school. And not that that's the reason I wanted to do it, but I just wanted to be the best as well. And so it was actually whilst I was training in gymnastics as well that I had some friends come in from the school pool, and they were completely drenched. I thought, what have they been doing? And they said, we've just been in this rowing boat and we've all fallen in. And so that was kind of the link across where I thought, I'm done with doing 4-hour sessions in the gym. It was grueling, and I just want to get outside as well. But looking back now, the sessions I've done rowing in the wind and the rain and hail, I'm like, why did I go for an outdoor sport? But that was essentially the hook in terms of getting outside. So yeah, I was lucky to have that sporty background, and rowing was kind of one of the last things that I tried, but I'm glad it stuck.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, you gave an example there of, wind, hail, etc. Can you give us an example of sessions where you just think, my God, this is tough. I'm not sure I can face this today.
Yeah, just especially racing through the middle of winter back at home as well. So we stay on the water year round, where rowers in Europe and kind of in the North America as well, they can't train over winter because the lakes freeze over and it gets icy, where we're on the water year round. And so there'll be times where you'll hop on the water and it will be kind of close to nearing freezing as well. And you've got 5 layers on. And where we rode predominantly up in Penrith as well, you're at the base of the Blue Mountains, and so you just get this icy blast coming through as well, and it's freezing before you've warmed up, but you're moving through the air at speed as the rest of your boat's warming up. So yeah, you face the elements day in, day out. It's raining sideways as well, so it's tough in that sense when you'd just rather be in kind of a warm chair inside.
Yeah, and you talked a few minutes ago about going for a gap year. How did rowing influence your decision at the age of 18 as to what might come next? So you've decided to take a gap year, which is obviously completely logical because it also allows you, with relatively low risk, experiment with rowing a bit further to really see if it's right. But at what point do you feel that rowing was really starting to push your decision making in terms of your future?
Yeah.
Because if you now go all in on rowing, it probably means you give up something somewhere else. An interesting thing about you is obviously you took longer to do your career at Swinburne, which kind of suggests that they were quite supportive of balancing rowing and education. But yeah, just curious to know how that weighed on your decision making when you were 18, 19, and going into that next phase of rowing. But was there a price that you were paying?
Yeah, and it funny enough, it never really felt like that as well, because I was just so in love with the sport. So that first year, decided to take a gap year out. A lot of my friends were doing the same thing, but they were traveling overseas, and I thought I just wanted to throw everything at this goal of getting to the Junior World Championships. So, and I had a blinder of a year that first year out of school. And so the way things happened actually was that usually the talent pathway is that you go from kind of your junior to under 23 to senior A, but the way it happened when my coaches nominated me for the senior team as well, without my knowledge as well, which nominating means you're essentially putting your hand up to be considered for that team as well. And so we had a World Cup hosted in Sydney that year. So every year post-Olympic year, they get held outside of Europe just to increase diversity in the sport. And it was Sydney in Australia. And so they threw my hat in the ring on my behalf just to see where I could go. And I actually ended up getting selected on the senior Australian team that year in the women's 8. And so we raced World Cup, and we actually broke a 7-year streak from the American women, who were kind of powerhouses in that event. And so that was kind of a moment where I thought, could actually kind of be good at this. And then got selected then for the under 23 World Championships in the junior pair. And then with that combination, the team and I, we also then, after the under 23 championships, we went and raced at Junior Worlds as well. So after that year, I kind of realized there's something here and I want to explore that further. And so it had never felt like I was sacrificing anything else, because I saw it more as an opportunity in that sense. And there was just so much to be gained from that. And And I kind of thought, well, look, there wasn't really anything major that was kind of pulling me any other direction at the time. I knew it was important to complete my studies. So I picked that up in 2014 and begun my degree then. But I think if somebody had pitched to me to start this career and say, yeah, you can do 8 years of training 3 times a day, I would have thought, oh, that sounds a bit too much. But it wasn't. It didn't start like that. We kind of slowly built up and more. And there was always that next carrot in front. So I always just had that drive to go further. But yeah, 2013 was an amazing year, and then kind of wanted to then follow that pathway. So then wanted to win a under 23 world championship the next year, and then the year after that was then qualifying year for the Olympics in the senior team. So it was quite kind of well timed in terms of when I came into the sport and the opportunities that were there.
Yeah, interesting. So when you made your choices about university education and stuff like that, were they very much secondary to rowing and in support of rowing? Is that kind of a fair way to position it?
Yeah. Cool. So I have quite a lot of kind of key interests as well. Like I used to want to be a vet, but I really liked my nature as well. I loved design, and so my head was in all these different places. But because kind of rowing was the big focus, I decided to kind of stay general. So I did a business management degree, and then this is really as far as I planned for the next 8 years in terms of my academics. I thought I'll just do a business degree, and then I'll kind of decide what I wanted to do once I get to the end of that.
Yeah. Okay. And in this whole period where you're rowing, and obviously you did 2 Olympic cycles, and obviously you're rowing much longer than that, but were there any seeds of self-doubt at any point during that time? So were there any points where you felt like this isn't for me, the results aren't coming in? And often we talk about resilience in athletes being quite high. So we'd love to know, when you had those moments of self-doubt, how would you convince yourself that no, actually this is the right course for me, and I'm gonna hold out?
Yeah, I think it's really easy to get ahead of yourself in that sense and looking too far down the track. And so when I had that first year out, I think if I had looked at the 2016 Olympics and thought, oh, I've got to make the team, then I definitely would have been kind of scared off in a sense, because you've got to make a senior team, and that is a really high standard of racing there, where instead I kind of working with my coach back at home, we really decided to make sure that I could kind of pace myself and build my confidence throughout as well. So kind of making sure I was racing with people my own age, but also learning how to race even domestically at kind of club regattas as well, because you know how to race, but you need to learn how to race and win as well. And it's being able to get down the track time and time again that helped a lot. So yeah, there were definitely moments of doubt as well. And rowing is not a sport for the faint-hearted. It's really, really tough, and you're essentially getting thrown up against the wall every day in terms of seeing who can survive. So when you're kind of in the middle of an ergo piece and your legs are screaming at you to stop as well, and you don't think you can go any longer, you do get those doubts of like, how long do I want to keep doing this? And actually, I remember a clear moment, one of my first races at school. I think it was literally one of my first races where I don't know, I think I might have thought it just would have been a bit of a walk in the park, and then I realized how painful it was when you're just under that much aerobic pressure. And I thought, oh no, I can't do this. This is not for me. And then we ended up winning. And then that just completely eliminated any of those thoughts of self-doubt as well. So that positive feedback loop that I was speaking before earlier was really, really strong. And I think when you see success, it kind of, the cost of that becomes worth it, even though it is a lot.
Yeah, that's interesting. And did you ever feel like your spot on the team was in question? So was that like an ongoing pressure that you were facing daily or weekly or monthly, or is it not quite like that? Is it more, there's yearly cycles? So if you've got your spot on the boat, then you've got funding for a year, so it kind of takes a bit of the pressure off from that perspective. Or is it not quite like that? Is it a bit more cutthroat that, if you have a bad month, then you could be off the squad?
Yeah, so the way that it worked kind of most recently, kind of post 2016, was that they centralized our training system, which meant that we essentially trained in the national squad year round, bar 3 or 4 weeks of the year, which we'd be spending at home on holidays. So then in that instance, you're getting monitored every single day. And yeah, it was really high pressure environment. You're constantly having to kind of fight and justify for your spot in that squad. So once we would get selected onto the Australian team, whether you're in kind of a pair, 4 or an 8, that's not set in stone as well, because you go and race at World Cups, and then if your boat underperforms, then anybody's on the chopping block in that sense as well. So there is a lot of pressure to perform day in, day out, and you've got to make sure that even on your worst day, you're able to bring a kind of top level performance. And so because you know that if you slip, there's someone who's the next ranked person below you that's kind of chomping at the heels, ready to take your spot. So you definitely do get that doubt occasionally, wondering, if you do have kind of what it takes to maintain that standard every day. And it is really hard because you just don't have a chance to slip up. But ultimately that drives kind of the strength of the squad going up. And we always say that a boat's only as strong as kind of the weakest link in there.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a nice saying. So at what point were you starting to think, I don't want to skip over, obviously, all your Olympic stuff and the kind of national wins and stuff like that. But I think from all of that we can take away that you're a very, very good rower. Sorry. When did you actually start thinking about the transition from rowing? So at what point did you think, okay, this maybe isn't for me anymore? And you're not thinking necessarily about moving away from rowing, but just a seed of thought making you think, is there something on the other side for me?
Yeah, I think it was towards probably the end of my second cycle, Olympic cycle. So we always work in 4-year blocks as well. And I think it was when I'd kind of fallen short again after World Championships. And this is probably when I'd had kind of the most hope in terms of an idea of success, and we'd failed to medal as well. And I kind of thought, and I wasn't spurred away from still going for that Olympic goal. That was always in my mind, but I kind of thought, look, I don't think this is something I could do for another 4 years if kind of these are the results I'm going to keep getting. And obviously I'd love to keep going at that as well, but I need to be real with myself that in a way rowing, it's not something that you can really make a career out of or make money on. So after a while, I kind of need to, I guess, give up the dream and kind of come into the real world. So I think that kind of planted the seed in terms of knowing that this, it's not something that would be sustainable to do forever. And I think I've realized as well that I had just gained so much intrinsically out of the sport as well, in terms of I'd been able to push myself to the absolute limit. I had whole teams of people employed to get the most out of myself as well. I traveled all around the world. And so I kind of got to that point of, look, the only thing that would really make this better is if I could get an Olympic medal as well. And it really just came down to really like how I want to spend my time and gambling that as well. And I kind of gave myself a bit of an ultimatum where I thought, this is after the Tokyo Games, and I thought, if I basically went and did another cycle, would it be worth it if I didn't end up with an Olympic medal? And I kind of thought the answer to that was no. So that's kind of when I knew. I've kind of skipped a bit of forward a bit in terms of when I knew I was wrapped up and done as well. But I kind of just started having that thought, kind of then stemming back from that in terms of, okay, well, what is it that I want to be doing after this as well? Because I realized it started to feel like I was kind of more spending a lot of my time within these 4 walls of rowing a bit, and it kind of was ready to kind of break out of that a little bit.
Was it a cliff, or was it a natural kind of progression where you finished the Olympic cycle, you're back in the boat, but you're just not feeling it? You're in the boat, but you're actually thinking, okay, I could be doing this, or was it a bit more cutthroat than that? You decided, no, I'm kind of done with it, and that was it.
I think after COVID, so when the Olympics got cancelled and we kind of had that extra year, that was probably the first time that I actually started to plan and look ahead a bit. And so I was able to pick up a few extra units of study, and then that meant that I was finishing my degree before going to the games. And then I thought, okay, well, basically after Tokyo, I had planned to take a year away from rowing. I think at that point I'd started to feel like a little bit burnt out as well. So yeah, planned to take a year away and kind of see how I felt after that. And then I kind of would have known having that time away from the rowing centre as well. So I guess it wasn't so much a cliff where I just thought, look, I kind of put that stop in for myself. And then that year went by really quickly. So 2022. And then essentially, if I wanted to go back, I would have had to, for the Olympics for 2024, I would have had to be back then because I need to be back to be in with a chance for the 23 qualifying season. And I just felt to my gut, I was like, I'm kind of doing other things outside of rowing now, which I'm loving, and I'm kind of ready to go down that route instead.
Yeah, interesting. Did you think there's too much pressure on the Olympics as the holy grail of a lot of kind of amateur sports? So whether it's swimming or rowing, a number of other sports where really there isn't really a professional scene at all. So it feels like the Olympics is basically the only measure of what will motivate me to continue doing this sport. When you've talked about the junior world titles, another guest is so happy with an under 23 world championship, all these other milestones, which are obviously incredible. You're still beating everybody in the world to achieve them. But the Olympics is really seen as the mantelpiece for sport, or certainly amateur sports like those. Do you think that's right, or do you think there should be a more fundamental shift so that athletes aren't pushed to feel like you've got to think in a 4-year cycle? Because in a way that feels a bit unhealthy, that do I have the energy to do this for another 4 years, when in fact, if the world championships were just as prestigious, you'd feel really motivated to get back in the boat and straight on it.
Yeah, and it is really tough working in those 4-year cycles, because that is a huge commitment. I think in today's kind of professional world, not many people kind of plan that far ahead. I know a few people do 5-year plans, but like for the most, because the world's changing so quickly, we're looking a year ahead and then seeing what happens there. So it is a huge ask to kind of put your life on hold for that long. And I know I mentioned at the start of my career, it didn't feel like that, but that kind of, and I think it's that point where that shift kind of came in, where it came from this all feeling like a great opportunity to then, okay, I did feel like I was putting other things on hold. So to kind of go back and answer your question, when I kind of knew and had started thinking about things, I felt it deep down when I felt like there were other things that I could be doing out in the world than rowing. So, and it was really tough, because I would have loved to say have raced for, kind of taken a year off and then just raced for one more year. But yeah, there aren't really kind of many other events which are kind of a pull to come into that. Like within rowing, there's a few other events around the world, such as kind of Henley Royal Regatta, which is, and that's accessible to people from kind of school club level into underage national team level, all the way to Olympians as well, which is amazing. But not everybody can race or come over to the UK from all ends of the world to do that as well. And so, yeah, it really is kind of the Olympics or nothing, in terms of if you're going to put aside your time, it needs to go towards that. So, but I think that is a privilege of it. I think if there were more events like the Olympics, then they wouldn't be as prestigious as well. So that kind of what makes them special and such a privilege.
Yeah, absolutely right. I guess the question, maybe I didn't ask it as best as I could have, but it's kind of, it feels like the governing bodies gear everything up towards winning medals at the Olympics. That's what we're investing in. That's the return on our investment we expect. But is there a better way to actually make rowers feel like it's not just about that? It's a job for you. You're there doing it every day. I read an article in the Irish Independent last week about a doctor who's also an elite rower. And he's really questioning whether it's worth going through the next kind of Olympic cycle, because just really simple things like he gets funding, but he eats the amount of calories that would be equivalent of a 4-person household. So just being an athlete actually means he's having to consume much more food. Then on top of that, you got all the rent, you got all the other stuff as well. Whilst on the background, he's got his career as a doctor that he could go back to. So I guess maybe the question is more around, should athletes be funded differently or better to make rowing not this cutthroat profession that it is, right? If you don't perform, you're out. But to encourage more people to encourage longevity in rowing is perhaps more the question, because speaking to a lot of swimmers, a lot of them haven't been back in the pool since retiring, which kind of feels a shame in a way. You see them on the blocks on TV and you're like, oh my god, I wish I could swim like those truly inspiring.
Mm.
But actually, the truth is, none of them have been back in the water since. And again, that's because so much focus is on 75,000 meters in the pool per week, and all of that's pointing towards going to the Olympics.
Mm. I think that really comes down to the commercial viability of each sport. And so I think when you compare a sport like rowing as well, where there is no professional element to it, I think as professional as it gets would be maybe a couple colleges as well, where you get a scholarship. But outside of that, you've got that kind of that amateur pathway where the goal is the Olympics. But outside of that, there isn't that. I know swimming, there was a World Swimming League for a while. I'm not sure if that's still around as well, where that gave athletes the opportunities to kind of be, I guess, kind of bought and kind of receive a salary and be part of a commercial team as well. But in the end, the sport like rowing, we don't have that commercial aspect as well. And so we don't have the opportunities for those funding flows, such as kind of sports like soccer, cricket, rugby as well. So I think, and in a way that kind of makes the sport more pure, because, everybody that is there for a really intrinsic sense because of their love for the sport and what they're doing as well. And it does come down to each country as well. So I know the UK amateur sports are lottery funded, which I think is a fantastic model, like knowing how much money kind of goes into the national lotteries each year. In Australia, we were fortunate enough to gain a private sponsor as well through Hancock Prospecting, which that really changed the game for us, because that meant when we went to that centralized model, all of a sudden it meant that we didn't have to work anymore. So I used to work a stand-up job in between 2 sessions in the morning and evening early on in my career. But then once we had that sponsorship money, it meant that kind of my kind of base living costs were covered and I could support myself through rowing. So it's different for every country in terms of how kind of those athlete support models work. But in the end, no one's really going to be making kind of a huge profit that you could live off from rowing. So fortunately, it is just the nature of the sport that we are in.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, it probably has many benefits to know that people on the start line are there, very driven by intrinsic motivators. Did you feel ready for work when your career ended? Did you feel like you had the baseline skills to bring to employers through rowing? Obviously you've learned a lot in rowing, but do you feel that made you work ready? And did you feel like you knew how to translate those skills into something that me as a manager would appreciate on an application form and the interview process?
I think I was definitely ready to go and work as well. I think I had enough of using my skills in that narrow skill set that was rowing, even though there is so much you can do with that in terms of kind of working with teams, kind of learning to apply work under pressure. So all those soft skills I knew that I had as well. And I was kind of ready to apply those in another environment. I think it did take a process of actually drawing those out of myself and putting them down onto paper to see how I could sell myself to potential employers. And I think it took a process of applying for jobs, getting feedback of why I hadn't progressed to the next rounds at all. So that post kind of Tokyo period, and we were still in lockdown. So I kind of spent a lot of time kind of up in the attic of my parents' house as well, kind of really looking inwards as well. So it took a while to kind of refine knowing what my soft skills were. And so it takes a level of self-awareness to understand where your strong parts are, where your shortfalls are as well. But then on the technical side of working, I'd done a bit of experience working for a boat building company for the few years preceding wrapping up with rowing and going to Tokyo as well. So it started to build that business acumen. I worked plenty of jobs before, but then taking that next level in terms of going into the corporate world, I was pretty green. So didn't have those technical skills. So I knew kind of it was going to be a bit of a steep learning curve getting into that.
Yeah, interesting. And how did you act? Well, the first question is, how do you tell the Australian governing body for rowing that you're retiring? Do you send them a text message? Do you send them a WhatsApp message to say, hey, I'm out? Do they keep funding you for a couple of months just to give you a bit of runway? Or just interested to know what the process is, and then after that, how do you then go about acting to find your next job?
Well, funny enough, I've never actually said the R word to myself. I just don't think that I've really been able to admit it to myself. And kind of like I mentioned after Tokyo, I never said, that's it, I'm done, because I honestly didn't know if I was. And so, I thought, look, I'll take a year out, see how I feel. And then essentially that kind of tipping point came to where you have to nominate for your team. So, which means just filling out a Google form, which is essentially putting your hand up and saying, I'd like to be considered for national selection. I guess that date came and went, and I didn't put that in. And so that was kind of me stepping away for another year. And then technically, like, some people have tried to do it coming back in the Olympic year, but it would have been an absolute long shot as well trying to do that. So I guess that kind of counted me out then for the Tokyo Games as well. And then the weights happened because I moved to London in the middle of 2023 last year. And so we're kind of at this point where if I wanted to, I could come back for Brisbane if I wanted to, but at the moment I've got other priorities on, so that's not really on the radar at the moment. But you can always come back. And so I think I don't want to say the R word, definitely, just in the case that, when I might decide when I'm kind of 34 and I might want to go to the Brisbane Games, I could still do that. Like, it would take a lot of work as well. So yeah, it's a funny thing that I haven't actually been able to admit that to myself, although I've got some pretty strong career aspirations. So that's what I want to do, but you never know how the world will pan out in that sense. So I've never I've never said to Rowing Australia, hey, I'm retired. You just kind of stop showing up, and that's it. There's no formal process, no fanfare or anything like that. And that's the case for rowers who do actually draw that line and say they're retired as well. You really you just get replaced by someone else, and they continue on as well. There's no real kind of acknowledgement of your career in that sense at all.
Yeah, it makes sense. So basically you're saying you don't actually retire, you just don't put your name forward, and therefore you don't get selected. So cool. Feeling a little bit guilty I put ex-Australian rower, but
for the moment,
I think that's okay, right? It's not saying retired. So
for the foreseeable future, that's the way it's going to be.
So cool. So in terms of acting, you've kind of made the decision you're going to take time away from rowing. And you've talked about career ambitions and aspirations going forward. How did you start acting on them? What were the first things you did? You talked about getting feedback from interviews, feedback about your CV to learn what maybe you could have done better to highlight your soft skills. What were you doing to try and help you understand what's your next career path? And I appreciate you're still quite young into your career anyway, so you might still be deciding that a little bit at the moment, but certainly in that initial stage after you've kind of stepped out of the rowing setup, how did you go about just acting on that decision to move into the real world?
It's a good question, and I've realized that I'm very much guided by my gut. And I think one thing you realize pretty quickly is if you're doing something that you don't enjoy and don't want to do, rather than kind of what you do want to do. And so having kind of done a more general degree, I did have a lot of options ahead of me as well. And I kind of wasn't really sure where I wanted to go. And so kind of my first kind of long-term role that I did outside of rowing was working at a tech startup. And I was working in charity partnerships. So essentially using a product, helping them leverage our product to bring in income for them. And I absolutely loved that as well. I loved working at a small organization as well. No 2 days were the same because there were always different challenges coming up as well. And so that involved a bit of marketing, a bit of project management as well. And so that's kind of where I started again to kind of build out my kind of career in that professional sense as well. But then after a year of that, I kind of thought, okay, this is good, but it was kind of very flat throughout the year. So as I mentioned, we used to kind of working in those 4-year cycles, but then within each of those years, we would have kind of 2 little peaks as we'd race World Cups throughout the season, and then a bigger peak each year as we raced to the World Championships. And I kind of didn't realize until I was lacking that in my life how much I thrived after those kind of peaks and troughs throughout, and kind of, those buildings, and then kind of stepping back a bit as you kind of go back and get into training, and then kind of taper off and come into a World Championships as well. So, and I think I realized that because we went to an event, it was a conference, and I was just absolutely buzzing. I was going, oh, like, how good's this? Like, loving being here. And everybody else around me was like, yeah, like, it's pretty good. And so that's when I realized I need to go back to that kind of events kind of process of where, you kind of going up and down. And I think I realized then after a bit of traveling, and I had some opportunities to see some great sporting events, saw the FIBA Women's Basketball World Cup, went and saw the Tour de France as well. I kind of put two and two together and realized I think I need to go back to working in sport. It is what I'm so passionate about. I think sport is in an incredibly unique position to captivate hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people all at one time on the same focus as well. And so I was happy to not be kind of in the spotlight anymore, but more in that facilitatory side in terms of being behind the scenes as well. So I've never kind of had that kind of, look down the track and going, oh, this is what I want to be doing. In my 5-year plan, I was more just my kind of idea of then moving over to London was I want to work in sport as well, and I'll find any way to do that. And that, so kind of being guided just by like, what do I need to do next?
Yeah, that's interesting. So you talked about your career being quite a big focus. So you talked loosely that you could go back to rowing if maybe you could, if you wanted to put in the effort. But you also talked about your career weighing quite big now in the decisions you make, and you're obviously finding your feet in it. What would make you? What is it about your career that's making you feel so good and motivated that I want to focus on that over, say, going back to rowing? Because you clearly feel passionate about your career. You obviously felt very passionate about rowing when you were doing it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have done it for as long as you did. So what is it about work now and the future of your career that's making you feel so motivated that I'm almost thinking of not going back to rowing because I love my job so much, and I wonder if it's somewhat linked to what you've been talking about, your work being linked to sport, being involved in sport. So it almost feels like your work now in some ways is potentially a quasi legacy of your own sporting career, that you can still do good through sport, just not as an athlete, just now in a kind of commercial role, whether it's a relationship or a sales role, if that makes any sort of sense.
No, and that's kind of exactly kind of where I'm at now in terms of my motivations as well. And so I think as much as it would nice to kind of what we call is in like Peter Panning with rowing and never growing up as well, that's kind of the way we would speak about it. I think realistically it's not really what I want to be doing anymore. And so I've got this new motivation kind of that I found in my career now. So where I'm kind of working at the moment, it's, I think, just being tied to that bigger purpose for something that's not about myself as well, because rowing, it is a very, very selfish pursuit. It's kind of all about you, and you're very much in your little bubble, and you're not really focusing that much about what's happening outside in the world as much as well. And so I'm kind of really excited to be putting my energy towards something that is kind of bigger than that. And as I kind of mentioned at the start, I had a lot of interest where I love kind of animals, being in nature, rowing being an outdoor sport. I've been privileged to race in beautiful lakes and rivers all around the world, especially in Australia, because nature is so integrated into our day-to-day life. It's something that I've always had that interest in. So when this role came up at Extreme, working in marketing, sustainability, it kind of just tied all of that together for me. And honestly, I just took the chance to jump at it as well. And I never thought that it's something that I could make a career out of in terms of combining those two loves of mine as well. I thought like it would be good enough if I could get that role in sport, but now that it's tied to a purpose, it's something that I find really motivating as well. And so with sport, we're in that kind of unique position that we're able to capture kind of the hearts and minds of audiences like no one else can. And look at our athletes, they're all cult figures as well. And they're in a really unique position to kind of raise awareness in terms of climate change and the issues that the kind of the world is facing. And so I think the fact that I can help use sport for good is a really, really motivating opportunity. And that's kind of got me hooked where I am at the moment.
So interesting listening to all of that, because in some ways it makes me think that being an elite rower in some ways is maybe easier and simpler than having to navigate all the difficult decisions of, okay, what career do I take? What country do I take that career to? Et cetera, et cetera. Whereas rowing is hard work, and it's a long, hard graft, but it's kind of simple. It's a 4-year cycle. It's the Olympics. It's day in, day out, and just slog away. And yes, of course, there's data, there's nutrition, all of these things, but the end goal is abundantly clear. Whereas with careers, well, for some people it's abundantly clear, but for others it's not. And unless you're a doctor or a lawyer, and even then it's not always crystal clear. So it's interesting to see how you're navigating it at the moment. Are there any kind of last question, conscious of time? Are there any kind of regrets you have, or not? Not. I think regrets is probably a strong word, because I've not met many guests who've had regrets. It's maybe more reflections on your rowing days and your approach to careers and kind of transitioning away from sport. Do you have any reflections on things you maybe would have done differently, or if not you personally, anything you would suggest or recommend to somebody who's coming up through those elite training programs offered by the governing bodies, in how they look at how they should approach their rowing days with an eye on the future, which I know is very, very difficult when you're meant to be all in on rowing.
I definitely don't have any regrets throughout my career, and I think that's one kind of attitude that I had early on, was that if I'm going to be dedicating all this time and the kind of energy and effort into this, then I need to make sure I'm doing it right as well. And so I kind of essentially, I didn't want to be upset with the results I didn't get from the work that I didn't put in the first place. So if I finished a race, I wanted to be sure that I had done everything I could to make that the best race that I could, and not have kind of any regrets in that sense, which I'm kind of confident to say that I feel like I put 100% of myself into that. So I can kind of look back and say, look, I gave it an absolute red hot crack, and the results that I kind of ended up with, that's the best I could do. So in that sense, no regrets. And I think the process in terms of doing my degree, I think you look back and you always wish you could have done things better. Where should I have studied a bit more intensely at times as well, and tried to get a bit more kind of work experience a bit later on in my career as well. I think it's always easy to look back in hindsight, but at the time, again, I think I do prefer to focus on less things and doing them well as well. And so, I didn't want anything to, I guess, if I had kind of picked up more work or more study, that could have compromised the rowing. And so I kind of remembered rowing was the main reason, the main kind of goal that I was after. So I think it's really knowing what your priorities are as well, because we do have some rowers that are kind of doctors and lawyers as well, and they managed kind of that study load whilst training as well, and they have the motivation to do that, because that is kind of, it's a clear kind of aim of theirs as well. But I think it's being aware of what your priorities are and where you kind of want to spend most of your time and energy, and being really intentional about that.
Yeah, cool. And definitely final question. What's your relationship like with rowing at the moment? I ask all my guests this as a kind of closing question. Just love to know, do you still row now, or have you kind of migrated to triathlon, which seems quite popular with a lot of rowers? Just curious to know how you interact with rowing at the moment.
I do really miss rowing and being in the boat. I think it's unlike anything else, that sensation of when you're in the water, you're in a crew, or even if you're in a single by yourself, and just everything is in harmony, and all you're thinking about is what you're doing for the next stroke. And it's kind of the definition of being in a flow state. And so I really do miss that as well. And so the first 2 years out of rowing still water, I joined a surf club, and I did the kind of more unconventional sport of surf boat rowing. And so that kind of was actually really helpful for me in terms of transitioning away, where kind of in the sense of taking ice cream away from a baby and you give them a lollipop before they have kind of get upset as well. I think it was a way for me to engage healthily with the sport, just in a new environment as well. And so, but now living over in the UK, we don't have that there. So there is rowing over here as well, but it's just a bit harder to access as well, because it is such a sport where you kind of got to be all in or nothing. It's not something that you can show up to once or twice a week and train. Like if you're joining the club, you got to be there every day. So taking a step back for the moment as well, which I think I am kind of missing a bit at the moment. I'm still kind of involved with kind of Rowing Australia. I'm a member on the Athletes Commission at the moment. So we kind of an advisory board just for kind of a number of key issues to kind of, I guess air those out as well, and kind of provide our own opinions and experiences in that sense. But no rowing at the moment. So I've joined kind of the running craze at the moment as well. So running all around London, doing a few half marathons here and there. So it keeps me fit as well, but definitely doesn't kind of scratch that itch.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Genevieve, for sharing, those insights and those stories of your journey from, your kind of, I guess what's the most fun about conversations like this is, I have a lot of guests across the spectrum. Some of them are kind of further on in their career where they're in VP of sales or director of sales roles, and you're at the other end where you're kind of, figuring it out and working your way through it. And often when people leave sport, they're also having to redefine their own identity a little bit. It's really interesting to kind of see where you've landed yourself now from a career perspective, where it kind of pays to your rowing past, but also allows you to flourish in that new direction that still pays respect to everything that you've done in the past and carries on that legacy in some way. So it'd be super interesting to see where you land over the next 4 or 5 years in terms of career paths, and maybe we'll have a follow-up podcast to see what that looks like and make it a version 2.
Yeah, it'll be great. That's the thing. I'm really excited to see kind of where we can take things from here as well, especially within work as well. We're about to go through kind of an exciting transition and kind of rebirth the company in a way. So I'm really keen to kind of go along with them for that journey as well. And yeah, we just don't know what things are going to look like within kind of the next 5 years. The world's changing so quickly. So it's kind of, I'm enjoying being in that unknown now in comparison to being in those 4-year cycles. So it's definitely something that I'm embracing.
Super. Well, thanks so much, Genevieve, for today. Really, really appreciate it. You've been a great guest, and I'm sure our listeners will take lots of lessons from it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's lovely to be met, Edward.